Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Cropper here, with some videos on the Metaphysics by Aristotle. Now, the Metaphysics is a bit of a conglomeration, and the reason it's titled as it is because Aristotle's works were compiled in the Middle Ages, and all of the stuff that didn't fit in some category somewhere in the other books, they put after the last book, which was physics, and the very last book is metaphysics, which literally means after the physics. But there is a general theme to it, or there are a couple of themes to the metaphysics, namely God, or the prime mover, and what is existence quo being, or the first science, the science before every other science. So we are going to take a look at that for what it's worth. And it's worth a lot. It's one of the most abstract and difficult readings in probably all of philosophy, except for Heidegger maybe, which is nonsense. So it's one of the most difficult, worthwhile readings in all of philosophy. That much is for sure. Now, I want to start with a quote from Ayn Rand, from the Ayn Rand lexicon, to define what metaphysics is. And then we will go to Bertrand Russell's description of Aristotle's metaphysics, and from there we will then, with some background, go into the metaphysics itself. Now this is from Ayn Rand's essay called The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made. Quote, "Things of human origin, whether physical or psychological, may be designated as man-made facts, as distinguished from the metaphysically given facts. A skyscraper is a man-made fact. A mountain is a metaphysically given fact. One can alter a skyscraper or blow it up just as one can alter or blow up a mountain. But as long as it exists, one cannot pretend that it is not there or that it is not what it is." So the metaphysical, there's Ayn Rand's a very, very short tidbit about it. The metaphysical, according to David Harriman, I believe it was, or maybe it was Leonard Peikoff, metaphysics is a very short subject. And the metaphysical is a very restricted category. It simply says something exists. And whatever it is that exists, it is what it is. It is itself. And then you're done with that subject. So, the reason Aristotle's goes on a bit is because of the prime mover and because of some confusions, and because you can't separate metaphysics from epistemology entirely. So as soon as you say there is something, and as objectivists say that's the end of the subject now, you next bring the question, how do you know there's something? So you immediately are on to epistemology when metaphysics is done. Now, on to Bertrand Russell, A History of Western Philosophy. On page 162, Bertrand Russell says of the metaphysics, which we're about to go into. He says, "It does not do to lay too much stress on any single passage, because there is liable to be a correction or modification of it in some later passage." So, the metaphysics, again, is not something written from beginning to end with a special thing in mind, a special goal or anything, or a thesis in mind. It was written over years, probably. Some of the stuff is probably notes from students, and it was all compiled later into one book because it just didn't fit in any of the other books. So it's kind of like the miscellaneous category, but it's dominated to a great extent by writings about the prime mover and such. In addition to the book by Bertrand Russell I've just showed you, I have Aristotle by McKeon. It's Introduction to Aristotle, and particularly the Metaphysics is translated by W.D. Ross. Also, I have a copy of On Man and the Universe, Aristotle, and this is based on the translation of John Henry McMahon, but this is his summary of the book with a few direct quotes rather than the actual text itself, which is what is in McKeon's, is the actual text. This also has books 1, 3, 7, 5, 7, and 12, if I remember right. And this has only books 1 and 12. Makian has only 1 and 12. So we will need some material from both of those. And where would anyone be in such a cerebral assignment without a little bit of Cliff Notes type stuff? What is this? Monarch Notes, The Philosophy of Aristotle, by Barbara Jancard, Jancar. Now, MacMahon tells us, quote, "The reader who is not a philosopher and who has hitherto not made Aristotle's acquaintance may do well to bypass temporarily the metaphysics." He says it's then easier to understand him when he's talking about biology or ethics than when he is talking about the causes and nature of universal being and existence as such. But after one has followed him for a while up and down these other areas, you can come back to the metaphysics and it won't be so formidable. I agree, but I've already gone through quite a lot of Aristotle, so at this point it's time to tackle it. Now let's begin with Book 1, Chapter 1. All men by nature have a desire to know. Now I interject there, Leonard Peikoff says that the refutation to that is to walk into any college classroom. But that is a very famous quote. And if you believe that all men have a desire to know, you're in good company because Aristotle says so. But maybe not. Maybe we can't count on an innate desire for knowledge. Aristotle was an optimistic and a Greek. He was an optimist and a Greek. He was an optimistic Greek, so we can let him off the hook there. Now he goes into a discussion about the senses and art, and we're going to skip over most of that, but let's just suffice it to say that art is produced when out of many ideas gained through experience we draw one general conclusion about some class of like cases. So art is taken from many instances and you make an archetype of it, if you will, or a generalization. Now I mention that to give you insight into the following. Quote, "The reason is that experience is knowledge of individual instances, and art is knowledge of universals." Now, those of you who are familiar with objectivism know concept formation, where you see this chair made of aluminum, and this one made of wood, and this one is a lazy boy made of material and cushioning, and you omit the measurements. Doesn't matter what they're made of, or how big they are, how much they weigh, or how much they cost. Leave the measurements out, and you've got the concept chair, a man-made object to sit on. Well, for Aristotle, the word universal means that thing which doesn't exist in any instance, right? Chairness as such doesn't exist here in this chair. It exists in every chair, but it doesn't really exist. It's just the chair that exists. Now, the difference between Plato and Aristotle is a little bit nitpicky. I mean, kind of like splitting hairs here on this particular concept. Plato says that there is a form of chair in heaven, the perfect chair, which is reflected in a fuzzy and inaccurate way in all the instances of chairs we see. But he holds that it really exists. And he holds that it exists in a more real way. Plato holds that the form chair exists in a more real way than the individual chairs. Aristotle says that the universal, he calls it universal, not a form, of chair, exists only in our mind, and that instances of it are the individual chairs, and that's where we learn about the universal. Now, he's dancing a bit on a fence, sort of, because these universals that exist only in the mind have properties and stuff, but we may or may not get that deep into it. But this lets you see where he's going with his theory of universals, and art is knowledge of universals. See, a carpenter just builds, the staircase or the chair or what the table for his customer. The artist working with wood, just like the carpenter, The artist produces something very different, even though they're both working with wood. And it's because the artist deals in universals, the carpenter deals in particular instances. So there we have art is to deal with universals. Now we skip a little ways down and let's go over something interesting about the five senses. He says, we do not regard any of the senses as wisdom. They are indeed our most authoritative sources of knowledge about individual objects, but they do not tell us the why of anything. As, for example, why fire is hot. They only tell us that it is hot. And he makes a good point here, and he says just a little bit above that, or just a little bit further down below, quote, sense perception is common to everyone and therefore easy, and calls for no wisdom. So having sensory knowledge is not wisdom itself. Anyone can do it. Everyone does it. So sense perception itself is not wisdom. Now, just another sentence or two down here, he shows an unfortunate theory-practice dichotomy, which was common back then, and Ayn Rand believes that you couldn't have gotten past this dichotomy until the Industrial Revolution. There was no way to know that thought radically changes the conditions of human life. So here's what Aristotle says, ignorant of the fact that thought changes the condition of human life. He says, among the sciences, too, also we call that science nearer to wisdom that is worth learning for its own sake and for the sake of knowing than the one that is desirable for the result to be got from it. So if a science is interesting or good or to know, just to know it, instead of the benefits you get from it, then it is a better science. Now, or you call it nearer to wisdom. Now, what would wisdom be then? Wisdom would be completely removed from anything to do with life. And so that is getting really far off the track as per modern human society. Because we believe that you do an awful lot of studying and then spend 40 hours a week applying your knowledge to benefit human life, to do something productive. And Aristotle says, out with all that. The best type of knowledge is that which has no effect and is not connected for where you're learning it for the sake of something. You're just learning it for itself. That's the real good stuff, he says, to learn it for itself. But what would you use it for if you knew it for itself? So you see here the theory-practice dichotomy, where they believe that work and trying to create benefits or something in the real world was sort of a workaday task. Not, it was beneath the notice of philosophers what was going on in the real day-to-day workaday world. So that's unfortunate. But then he does have some interesting advice. Quote, a wise man ought not to receive orders, but to give them, nor should he obey another, but the less wise should obey him. That's interesting advice, and it bites at the heels of democracy. And they weren't, Plato and Aristotle and a lot of the aristocrats of the time weren't particularly fond of democracy. It had a bad track record, and indeed, the founding fathers of the United States were not at all fond of democracy because it's dangerous. They believed in a constitutional republic, where a written document limits the power of the government, and there's a system of voting, but it's very restricted, and it's not absolutely, mob rule the way it was in ancient Greece. So there's some advice against democracy, that a wise man ought not to receive orders, but should give them. Now, how do you choose who the wise man is? See, in a modern republic, we vote. And, real idiots get in there, but still, that's why you have the Constitution to limit the power. But to continue to this question of the universals, and the fact that sense perception tells you individual things, but it takes some sort of knowledge to get up to knowledge of the universals, he says, quote, These things, the most universal, are perhaps the most difficult things for men to grasp, for they are the farthest removed from the senses. Now, the footnote mentions or clarifies. General laws, causes, principles, types, tendencies, etc. are all necessarily abstract. We cannot see them or touch them. Now, that's true, and the only difference between Aristotelian thinking on this subject and Ayn Rand's thinking is that Ayn Rand puts in the concept of measurement omission as being the essence of what's going on there. Aristotle realized that you start with the senses and you build from there. The senses are our first and our only, ultimately, source of knowledge if you read the Analytics. There is no other source of knowledge, but the higher up concepts are virtually separate from but they are built from the senses, but they're separate from the senses. Now, he does some equivocation, which we don't need to go through, some somersaults and stuff near spraining his ankle, but he comes out with the following conclusion. Quote, "Supreme, then, among the sciences, and superior to all subordinate science, is that which knows the end for which everything takes place, that which is the good for each thing, and as a whole the highest good for all nature." Now, after the extortion he goes through to get there, let's just put that on the table, that the supreme science to which all subordinate science is less important, the supreme science asks what is the good for each thing and what is the highest good for the whole and for all of nature. Now, you might think that knowing the supreme and the highest good for all nature would come into use somewhere. But he says a little further down, quote, "As we call a man free who lives for his own sake and not for another's, so we call this the only free science, for it alone exists for itself." He drives this point home a couple different ways in different times here. He says that this is the supreme science and that it is not used for producing anything. It is not used to produce things, and that is plain from the story of the earliest philosophers, he says. This is the first science. Metaphysics is what we call it now. The question of the existence of things as such. Now, the Greeks were very nervous about infinity, and Aristotle believed that you could have matter existing forever, but you couldn't have motion existing without it being started. I've said elsewhere in a video about the prime mover that I think it may have been, it's hard to say exactly what he had going on in his mind, but it may have been his way of avoiding being called an atheist, and he probably was an atheist. Will Durant says in the Story of Philosophy that he thinks that Aristotle's prime mover was simply anti-Macedonian hemlock. Against hemlock from Macedonia, which is what killed Socrates. So, if that's the case, then there is just a lot of equivocation around the prime mover. But it's an exquisitely reasoned equivocation, and it has distracted a lot of people through history ever since. So we do have to look into it, even though it may just be an equivocation to save him from trouble, as Will Durant thinks and as I agree. But having mentioned the prime mover in that way, let us now go to this last quote in Book 1. "This science alone is divine in two ways." So it's the only divine science. "A science which belongs peculiarly to God himself is a divine science. So also is one that deals with divine things." Now remember that this is the science of what is the best and what is good for everything, and therefore what does everything move towards or want or seek. Now this science alone has both these characteristics. That is, that it belongs to God and it deals with divine things. Continuing, everyone believes that God is one of the causes and a first principle of things, and either God alone, or he above all others possesses this science. So every other science may be more necessary than this, but none is more noble. Every other science may be more necessary, in other words, useful. We may need them to get along in human life. But this is the most noble science, and useless. So, that's another view into his theory-practice dichotomy. Right here in the beginning of Book 2, he says, the object of theoretical knowledge is truth, whereas of practical knowledge it is action. Even if practical men do ask how a thing is as it is, they are not trying to understand eternal being, but only something relative and immediate. But the first science is trying to understand eternal being. Now, remember that Aristotle believed the heavens to be separate and different from the earth, and he believed that the earth was temporal and the earth was eternal, and that, the heavens were eternal. He believed that the heavens were unchanging, and the earth is the only place where change occurred. So he then goes on into a couple paragraphs here of getting mixed up about what's the difference between the eternal substances and a temporal substance. And it's all just, make-believe fantasy looking back from where we are, because we know that the moon and sun are just matter, just like the earth. Now we skip to Book 4, and there's a short paragraph which should probably be at the very top of Book 1. But let me read it here. There is a science that studies being as being, and the properties characteristic of being as being. It is not the same as any one of the so-called special sciences, for none of the others deals with being generally as being. They cut off a piece of it, and study the character of that piece, as, for instance, the mathematical sciences do. Or another one would be biology. You cut off a little piece of reality and say, I'm just looking at this sliver, and this is called math. Or I'm looking at that sliver, and it's called biology. Or this other area, it's called geology. And Aristotle says if you look at all those, take every single one of those sciences and cram them together instead of cutting pieces off, all of them together is the first science, he calls it. We call it metaphysics. Now we skip all the way to Book 12, Chapter 6 of Book 12. Quote, it is impossible that motion should ever have begun to be, or should ever be destroyed, for it always was. Time, too, can never have begun, for there could never not be a before nor an after, if time did not exist. Motion, then, is forever continuing, as time is, for time is either the same as motion or a condition of motion. But there is no continuous motion, but motion in place, and of this only motion in a circle. So all motion, in the sense that there are things moving in the world today, it couldn't have always been like this. This had to be started. But it couldn't be started if there was not something moving, and the only thing that could have been eternally moving is the most perfect type of motion, which is in a circle. So he does not allow that you can have an infinite regression of motions unless you allow the moving of one thing in a circle to be an infinity of motions. But he says that's not, it's just one complete motion in itself. So that's an exception to his idea that there can be no infinity of regress, no infinite regress. You have to come to the prime mover. But the prime mover may be involved with this circular motion, the most perfect motion that doesn't actually go anywhere. So deeper and deeper into equivocation. From McKeon, Book 12, also Chapter 6, but a different translation. It is impossible that movement should either have come into being or cease to be, for it must always have existed, or that time should, for there could not be a before and an after if time did not exist. Movement also is continuous then, in the sense in which time is, for time is either the same thing as movement or an attribute of movement. And there is no continuous movement except movement in place, and of this only that which is circular is continuous. So it cannot move from its place, and it has to go in a circle, in its place. That's the only type of continuous motion, and that has somehow, that has to have caused all other quote-unquote continuous motion, non-movement in place, movement from one place to another. Now in the next paragraph, Aristotle says, but if there is something which is capable of moving things, or acting on them, but is not actually doing so, there will not necessarily be movement, for that which has a potency need not exercise it. Nothing, then, is gained, even if we suppose eternal substances, as the believers in the forms do, unless there is to be in them some principle which can cause change. That's the part where I mentioned, I said, all motion in the real world has to have been caused by, ultimately, in some way, this motion from this eternal, circular, perfect motion. And those who he's taking a jab there at Plato's philosophy of the forms. He says there are these believers in eternal substances called the forms, but unless the forms can cause change in the real world, the forms don't explain anything. You've got to explain what's going on in the real world and why the real world is the way it is, coming from the first principles of the eternal substances, or heaven and whatever. And if you can't explain that, your theory is not worth anything. He says, therefore, the theory of forms is useless, because the forms were never said by Plato to act in any way. Plato said that objects like chairs participate in the form of chairness in heaven, and instances of justice participate in the form of justice. But Aristotle said this is just pretty flowery words and rhetoric. So he says, unless you can explain how heaven is causing change in the real world, you can't explain anything with your theory, and it's no good as a theory of first causes or universals. Nay, even this is not enough, nor is another substance besides the forms enough. For if it is not to act, there will be no movement. Further, even if it does act, this will not be enough, if its essence is potency, for there will not be eternal movement. Now, you've got, he says potency, but he's coming from potential. So you have, its essence cannot be potentiality, because if something's potentially the case, it doesn't mean that it's actually the case. So the essence in heaven, whatever is at the root of everything, cannot be an essence of potentiality. It has to be an essence of actuality, so that there will be no possibility of it not being. It must be. If it's an essence of actuality, then it actually is, not just potentially is. So whatever the prime mover or the source of all motion or whatever it is, its essence has to be actuality. There must then be such a principle, whose very essence is actuality. Further then, these substances must be without matter, for they must be eternal, if anything is eternal. Right? So there's something that's eternal, and it's got to be this. There's rationalism. Therefore, they must be actuality. So the essence of actuality is the eternal center or essence or beginning of the universe. Actuality itself, actuality as such. Now he says a little further down that actuality is prior to potency, so that there's no question of whether or not saying that it's simply actual is preying on or begging the question from potency. And now if actuality is prior to potency, then there is a constant cycle. Something must always remain acting in the same way. This thing was the cause of eternal uniformity, and something else is the cause of variety, and evidently both together they are the cause of eternal variety. Now we skip a little ways down to a key concept or passage. Now if something is moved, it is capable of being otherwise than it is. Therefore, if its actuality is the primary form of spatial motion, then insofar as it is subject to change, in this respect it is capable of being otherwise. Now, that's a key problem, because if the prime mover is actuality itself, and if it is the most perfect thing, and if it is changeless, what if it were to change? It would have to change to a less perfect thing. So therefore, there can't be change. And it has to, therefore, not move, because if it were to move, it would go from one way of being to another, and if it was in a perfect way, then it would be in a less perfect way after moving. So it can't move, but it has to initiate all motion. Now remember, moving doesn't necessarily count. You can't really say something's moving if it's going in a circle. That's relatively perfect eternal motion, which doesn't count as motion. Continuing. Since there is something which moves, while itself unmoved, actually existing, this can in no way be other than it is. So whatever that prime mover is, it does not move itself, and it causes motion in other things. It is what it is necessarily and could not be different than it is. Now, here's, if you're wondering about this contradiction with the circle, get this. For motion in space is the first of the kinds of change, and motion in a circle is the first kind of spatial motion, and this the first mover produces. So the first mover produces the first kind of spatial motion, which is motion in a circle. And the footnote says, if it had any movement, it would have the first. If the prime mover had any movement, it would have a first kind of movement. But it produces this, and therefore cannot share in it. For if it did, we should have to look for something that is prior to the first mover and imparts this motion to it. So the first mover himself creates motion in a circle, but does not and could not share in it. And motion in a circle is the first type of motion, and if the first mover did move, that would be the type of motion he undertook. But he does not move, because if he did move, then you would have to go and show what caused him to move. And then you would be in a mess. Quote, the first mover, then, exists of necessity, and insofar as it exists by necessity, its mode of being is good, and it is in this sense a first principle. On such a principle, then, depend the heavens and the world of nature, and it is a life such as the best which we enjoy, and enjoy for but a short time, since its actuality is also pleasure, and for this reason are waking, perception, and thinking most pleasant, and hopes and memories are so on account of these. Now, he says that whatever pleasure we take in the universe, when we have a good feeling or we're enjoying our day or something, that type of the best feeling of pleasure is what the first mover feels all the time. Rather pithy. Because post-Darwinian and being atheists, we know that pleasure is simply a sign that you're doing what you need to support your life. And an eternal being feeling that is just a ridiculous thought. But that's how outdated some of these thoughts are. We skip down a little bit. We're in Book 12, Chapter 7. If, then, God is always in that good state in which we sometimes are, this compels our wonder, and if in a better state than we sometimes are, this compels it yet more. And God is in a better state, and life also belongs to God, for the actuality of thought is life, and God is that actuality, and God's self-dependent actuality is life most good and eternal. We say, therefore, that God is a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration continuous and eternal belong to God, for this is God. Now, I don't know how much of that you can really believe Aristotle believed, but there it is for what it's worth. Now we skip down a little ways. Quote, "It is clear then from what has been said that there is a substance which is eternal and unmovable and separate from sensible things. It has been shown also that this substance cannot have any magnitude, but is without part and indivisible, for it produces movement through infinite time, but nothing finite has infinite power, and while every magnitude is either infinite or finite, it cannot for the above reason have finite magnitude, and it cannot have infinite magnitude, because there is no infinite magnitude at all. But it has also, so it doesn't have magnitude, right? Cannot have finite or infinite magnitude. But it has also been shown that it is impassive and unalterable, and for all other changes are posterior to change of place." So since it doesn't move and can't move and only causes movement, it itself cannot be altered in any way. Now, a very bizarre question arises. Quote, "We must not ignore the question whether we have to suppose one such substance, or more than one, and if the latter, how many? We must also mention regarding the opinions expressed by others that they have said nothing about the number of substances that can even be clearly stated. For the theory of ideas has no special discussion of the subject. For those who speak of ideas say the ideas are numbers, and they speak of numbers now as unlimited, now as limited by the number 10. But as for the reason why there should be just so many numbers, nothing is said with any demonstrative exactness." So he's upset about the people, the Pythagoreans, who are obsessed with numbers as such, and he says they can't give a convincing reason why you have to limit the number of eternal substances. Now, the prime mover, most people think of the prime mover as God's answer, or Aristotle's answer to God, how to get a God. But he had more than one, so hang on to your seat here. We're going to skip through his equivocation because it's equivocation. But here's what he says at the end of it. "Evidently, then, there must be substances which are of the same number as the movements of the stars, and in their natural eternal, and in themselves unmovable, and without magnitude, for the reason before mentioned. That the movers are substances, then, and that one of these is first, and another second, according to the same order as the movement of the stars, is evident." So now it's not the prime mover, it's the prime movers. "But in the number of the movements we reach a problem which must be treated from the standpoint of that one of the mathematical sciences which is most akin to philosophy, viz. Astronomy. For this science speculates about substance which is perceptible but eternal, but the other mathematical sciences, i.e. the arithmetic and geometry, treat of no substance." So now he goes into what the movement, what astronomy says the movement of the sun and so on involves. Eudoxus, for example, says there are 3 spheres involved in moving the sun itself, and you can imagine with the fact that there are no spheres out there, and that movement is in a Newtonian fashion, looking up at the stars and seeing once in a while Mars actually goes backwards in the sky and then forwards again, and to figure out all this and decide how many eternal spheres are out there turning in their various ways to create this movement, you could go virtually crazy trying to figure it out. and apparently it did get just a bit into Aristotle's brain. But he decides on a certain number. Callippus disagreed with Eudoxus on the numbers, so that it's not easy to figure this out. Callippus wanted to add 2 more spheres to the sun and 2 more to the moon, quote, if one is to explain the observed facts, and 1 more to each of the other planets. So that's adding 2 to the sun, 2 to the moon's 4, and then 1 for each of the other planets, which were, I believe, 6 at the time. I don't know if they probably didn't include Earth as a planet. So there's a total of 10 extra spheres over what Eudoxus called for. And then here's what Aristotle says. Quote, but it is necessary, if all the spheres combined are to explain the observed facts, that for each of the planets there should be other spheres, 1 fewer than those hitherto assigned, which counteract those already mentioned and bring them back to the same position, the outermost sphere of the star, which is in each case situated below the star in question, for only thus can all the forces at work produce the observed motion of the planets. So thank you, Aristotle, for straightening out all that, taking 1 sphere away from each one of the planets, because that's the only way to explain the motion. Since then, the spheres involved in the movement of the planets themselves are 8 for Saturn and Jupiter, and 24 for the others, and of these only those involved in the movements of the lowest situated planet need not be counteracted. The spheres which counteract those of the outermost 2 planets will be 6 in number, and the spheres which counteract those of the next 4 planets will be 16. Therefore, the number of all the spheres, both those which move the planets and those which counteract these, will be 55. And if one were not to add the moon and to the sun the movements we mentioned, the whole set of spheres will be 47 in number. There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. There are either 55 prime movers in the universe or 47, depending on whether or not you count the sun and the moon. Maybe you just count the planets. Let this then be taken as the number of spheres, so that the unmovable substances and principles also may probably be taken as just so many. Evidently, there is but one heaven, he says. For if there are many heavens, as there are many men, the moving principles of which each heaven will have 1, will be 1 in form, but in number many. But all things are many in number. All things which are many in number have matter. For one and the same definition, example given that of a man, applies to many things, while Socrates is one. But the primary essence has not matter, for it is complete reality. So the unmovable mover is one both in definition and in number. So too, therefore, is that which is moved always and continuously. Therefore, there is one heaven alone. Now, if the primary essence has not matter, for it is complete reality, and the unmovable mover is one both in definition and in number, then I don't know what the whole 47 or 55 is. These are the eternal spheres which are moved, but as Bertrand Russell says, the idea that Aristotle was monotheistic isn't true. He had either 47 or 55 gods. So, that's just how clear this is. Are these different gods, or are they just moving spheres? Are they separate heavens? Obviously, it looks so much like they could be separate heavens that Aristotle has to put this parentheses here. And if they are separate heavens, why would there be a god over all of them? Why wouldn't each heaven have its own god? So, what a mess. That's all I can say. But evidently there is only one heaven, says Aristotle, because if there are multiples of a thing, and there comes his Platonic reasoning. If you have one, the essence, the form, the universal, then it can be without matter. But if there are multiple instances of it, then they have to be with matter. But heaven's not made of matter, obviously. We all know that. Therefore, there must only be one heaven. Good thing we figured that out. Now, just to clarify the question on heaven, Monarch Notes, Philosophy of Aristotle, page 139. After discussing the possible number of unmoved movers, Aristotle suggests in this chapter that there must be some 49 eternal substances. So some people get different counts on it. Bertrand Russell had 47. Later in Book Lambda, however, he repeats there is only one unmoved mover who is divine. And then it goes on about what scholars think about this, and they think that the unmoved mover is not an essential part of Aristotle's philosophy. Well, it certainly isn't an essential part of his ethics, that's for sure. But it is surely a very messy idea, and it's so inconsistent. But to continue, to go back to the Metaphysics then, chapter 9, as we were getting to, the nature of divine thought involves certain problems. Leaving behind now the mess of 47 or 49 or 57, 55. Leaving it behind, what does the unmoved mover think about, such as he is? There are problems with divine thought. Quote, if the unmoved mover thinks of nothing, what is there here of dignity? So he's got to think of something, if he has any dignity at all. It's just like one who sleeps, if he doesn't think of anything. And if it thinks, but this depends on something else, then it cannot be the best substance, for it is through thinking that its value belongs to it. So it can't think of some other object, or else it depends on that object for its value of thinking. So it's got to think about itself then, is the conclusion there. Further, whether its substance is the faculty of thought or the act of thinking, what does it think of? Either of itself or of something else. And if of something else, either of the same thing always or of something different. Are there not some things about which it is incredible that it should think? Evidently, then, it thinks of that which is most divine and precious, and it does not change, for change would be change for the worse. If you're thinking about the very best thing, and then you change what you're thinking about, then you're not thinking about the best thing anymore. So if it's thinking about the best thing, it's got to always think about the best thing. And this, what is the best thing, ladies and gentlemen? Itself. So it sits and thinks about itself. We skip just a little bit. Therefore, it must be of itself that the divine thought thinks, since it is the most excellent thing, and its thinking is a thinking on thinking. Right? Because that's what the divine essence does. So it thinks about itself sitting and thinking, because that's the most perfect thing, and it couldn't change. We already went over why it can't change. Now with that, I think we can finish, with Aristotle's Metaphysics. There are very few other concepts that are really worth the time in it. I would suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that if you want to learn more about the metaphysics or want to go over it and sort of clarify it for yourself, that you get something like Monarch Notes or Cliff Notes or Spark Notes, which I tell you what, I read from The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant. I read the little snippet on it. I also read from a couple of other things, which I don't have at my elbow here because they weren't worth quoting from the History of Philosophy by Weber, W-E-B-E-R, and a few others. And it's just really messy, equivocational thinking. I think we've gotten the most out of it that we can in a short YouTube series of videos here. If you do delve into it further to look at it for yourself, these translations like MacMahon and McKeon are fine, but you should probably hit it with a large smattering of material. Get 3 or 4 books, a couple translations, and then something explaining it or a discussion on it, and then a little summary of it inside of the History of Philosophy by a philosopher, and put all that together and you'll get your head around what there is to get around in the metaphysics. Now, it is said that the metaphysics was the groundwork on which Thomas Aquinas based his 5 ways. And that will be the follow-up video to this, or part 2 to the metaphysics will be Aquinas' defense of God with his 5 ways, 3 of which came from Maimonides. Heads up.